Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Positive Partnerships webinar series, and today we're talking about communication. We'll go through a number of slides, and I'll pause every now and again in order to give you time to think about what I've said or to write down some notes. And if you want to do that and participate that way, that would be fantastic. My name is Rebecca Sutherland. I'm a speech pathologist and I work with Positive Partnerships mostly in a research and writing capacity, but I'm still a speech pathologist in some other jobs, so I like talking about communication, and hopefully what we talk about today will give you a bit more insight into how your child's communicating and some little ideas about how you might be able to help him or her communicate better. You're obviously watching and listening to a webinar that's been recorded. There's not any interactive portions today, but we'll go through and hopefully you'll be able to be interactive using some of the ideas and some of the documents that we direct you to download. My plan today is to give you an overview of communication in autism spectrum disorder, to encourage you to have a think about how your own child communicates and what impact those communication characteristics have on his or her social, educational, academic and other functioning as he goes through his life. And we'll talk briefly about some strategies that might help. Because all children with autism are very different, this isn't a one-size-fits-all webinar. You probably won't hear exactly the answers you need, but the idea is that we'll cover some information that will be relevant to most children with autism, and that you'll be able to have a think about how that relates to your child and hopefully come up with some of the ideas and strategies that might be useful for them as well. And just as we get into some of the content, what I would ask you to think about is, what do you want to get out of this time? You've committed this time to listening and to learning about communication, to have a think about what you need from this and how you'll be able to use this time best as you go through. We're going to start off with simply asking, what is communication? And we know that communication is an incredibly important life skill that most of us do take for granted. But I think as parents or as teachers or those who work with us who work or know children with communication impairment, we do suddenly become incredibly aware of communication and of how difficult life can be when communication doesn't work well for a child. We know that communication isn't just about speaking. We know that we all start to communicate and can communicate a lot of things through our behaviour and non-verbal messages long before we can speak. So communication, while it often does involve speech, isn't dependent on speech. And it's about two or more people sharing a message, and it's the exchange of information, thoughts or opinions between two people. And in this definition, we think about communication as involving the use of conventional, which means easily recognisable or shared signs, or unconventional signals that may occur through spoken or other modes. And this is a quote from the Department of Human Services in Victoria. So what we're really saying is that it's a way of sharing a message between two people that needs to be sent and understood using a range of different signals and communication types. And when we think about communication, we do tend to break it down into both expressive communication and receptive communication. So expressive communication involves the sending of a message, and it can be sent using a range of different forms of communication, including verbal forms, which is speech, or non-verbal forms, which might include gesture or facial expression, tone of voice, or other behaviours. We know that pictures can also be used to send a message, or formal sign systems. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the forms of communication shortly. Receptive communication involves receiving and interpreting the message. Receptive communication is often called comprehension or understanding. And you'll see that for anyone who's been to a speech pathologist and has a speech pathology report, you'll talk about expressive and receptive communication. And really what we're talking about is the ability to understand both the intent, so what the person's trying to say, as well as the actual meaning of somebody's effort to communicate. And it's really crucial. And what we know about children with autism is often their receptive communication or receptive language is quite significantly impaired, or they have quite significant difficulties with understanding the messages that people are sending them through speech or through gesture or through other means of communication. Another way of looking at communication is to break it down into form, content and function. And this is the how, the what and the why of communication. And it's really important to recognise that we only communicate effectively when all areas of this, all three areas here are working well. So we need to have form and content and function all going well. Function refers to the why of communication, why we communicate. And the functions of communication can be summarised into a few broad categories, including requesting. So we might request food or objects, we might request attention, or we might request information. Another function is protesting, another function is commenting, so providing information or labelling things, and then social interaction, including greetings and farewells. The form of communication is about how we communicate, and we need to look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. We also know that we need to have something to say, so the content of communication is really important. It's the message or the meaning of our communication. And when we're thinking about content, we know that it can be either concrete or abstract, it can be implied, and we know that it certainly relies on the communication partner's shared understanding. So to have that content is really crucial. And to have our content of our message make sense to other people, we need to have an accurate understanding of the meaning of words and phrases and expressions, as well as having a really good guess or a good understanding about the probable meaning of non-verbal behaviours, like a gesture or a smile or a smirk or a wink. And this is true when we're trying to interpret the communication of other people as well. And to come back to form, the form of communication refers to how we communicate. And in children with autism, this can be a really wide range of different forms. Obviously, speech is the most recognised forms in terms of sentences and conversation and being able to participate in a back and forth exchange using speech, because it's our most readily available, it's our most readily understood form. And so I think it's fair to say that it's certainly what we'd be aiming for most children when speech pathologists are working for them, for example, and when you're thinking about your child and where they are at the moment, you can see that each of the levels of the different forms are working towards speech because it's the easiest to understand and interpret in the community. What's really important, though, is to recognise where individual children are at the moment and to see their communication as valid, to help everybody who's involved to understand that better, and then to recognise that if this is the starting point, where might they be able to progress next in their communication. So the different forms can include body language, so really having to read a child's communication very well. If they're standing next to a fridge and looking at it, we need to interpret, for example, that they might be hungry or they might be wanting something in there. Another form might be leading by the hand and being quite showing good intent of communication, understanding that the child understands that they need to get an adult to help them meet their requests or to show that adult what they want. And so we often see children with autism leading their parents by the hand to request or to comment on something. Another form might be gestures and sounds, again where there's some communicative intent but not yet in a formal symbolic sense. To leap then into formal communication or symbolic communication is a really big step, certainly one that we'd be aiming for many children. And in symbolic communication, we have not only words that form conversations and sentences, but we also have elements of pictures and signing, which can be really, really helpful forms of communication for a child when their speech is still developing. And for those children whose speech isn't really working for them as their best form of communication. So what is useful at this point, I guess, is just to have a little bit of a think about where your child is communicating, what form do they communicate best in at the moment, and what form might be their next step up in those hierarchies. I think it's also worth having a look at what are the general communication challenges in autism. We know that autism is a very wide spectrum disorder, so some of you listening today will be working or knowing or living with children who have very limited communication skills at the moment, who might be really struggling with those early elements of intentional communication, even in informal ways. Others of you might be listening and know children who are very high functioning or have speech is very well developed, but who still have very significant communication challenges. And we'll talk about those as well just now. So some of the communication challenges we see for children with autism include the following that you'll be able to see on your screens there. There's understanding the need to communicate is a big one, especially for those children who are at that very early or unintentional stage of communication, where they haven't yet understood that in order to get a need met or in order to gain an interaction with somebody, that they need to communicate in some way, whether that's with speech or with behaviour or with other informal means of communicating. Many children with autism, as I flagged, have got difficulties understanding the spoken communication of others. And we, as speech pathologists, we describe that as difficulties with comprehension or difficulties with receptive communication. And we're not really sure why this is such a significant difficulty for children with autism, but one of the things we do see very commonly with children with autism is that people tend to overestimate how much they understand, because sometimes children's expressive communication can be much stronger than their receptive communication. And sometimes this is because of the echolalia that goes along with autism. So sometimes children learn to repeat, or they can imitate very well what adults around them have said or what they've heard on the television. And so they're often able to produce quite complex language, maybe even sentence-level communication, but may not have a strong understanding of what they're actually saying themselves. But it leads communication partners a bit astray, because we all tend to think that a child is able to understand at the same level that they're expressing themselves. But with autism, we know that because echolalia gives a bit of a false impression of how strong a child's language skills might be, that we might overestimate how much they're actually understanding. And this is true even into the older years, and for children with strong language skills, that we might actually see a discrepancy or a difference still between their expressive communication and their somewhat poor receptive communication. Some of the challenges also include theory of mind, where children might not necessarily understand or be able to guess at what another person's thinking, which can lead to communication breakdown, certainly, and to miscommunication and misunderstandings. We know there's expressive communication difficulties and difficulties understanding the rules of social communication. And I'll have a brief chat about some of these other elements as we go through, and some strategies to have a look at that. For people who are interested particularly in echolalia, there's a fact sheet on the Positive Partnerships website detailing echolalia a little bit further. In front of you, you'll be able to see the Positive Partnerships Planning Matrix. This is a really useful document, and it's available for download or for completion on the Positive Partnerships website, and you'll find that in the Positive Partnerships website under the Tools section. It's really worth printing this off or filling it in on the computer, and it's a great document that helps parents and teachers and other people working with a child with autism to really capture their basic characteristics, their basic qualities, and the strategies that are relevant to them across all of the areas of difficulties that we see with autism. And today we're going to really think about the communication section of this Positive Partnerships Planning Matrix, particularly focusing on the characteristics, the implications, and the strategies that might be useful. So if you can pause now, or if you want to just copy out what that might look like, so you can fill in a few details, that would be great. And the next few minutes are going to be spent really looking at those three areas of characteristics, impacts and strategies, or implications and strategies, so that you can start to complete this matrix yourself. So to begin with, it's worth thinking about your child's skills at the moment in terms of their communication across these different functions. So have a think about how your child makes requests and how they request perhaps for things, or action or information. For some children, they will find this the easiest form of communication. And you may have seen when they were younger that this was the first form of communication that they developed. So they developed perhaps much better skills in requesting, for example, than in commenting, or that it was much harder to learn social interactions at an earlier age. And what you might find is when you think about this, about how does your child make requests or comments, protests, or engage in social interactions, that you might find that your child is good at making verbal requests, for example, but they still might use different behaviours or even challenging behaviours to protest and to communicate that they're finished or that they're saying no about something. So it's worth having a think about these different functions of communication and the form your child uses, as well as thinking about what type of information and how much information they understand. The next thing we'd look at are the implications of the communication difficulties or those communication characteristics at both home and school. For some students, it might be that their communication difficulties in terms of understanding what people are saying are leading them to be very anxious, very confused, or perhaps even non-compliant at school or having difficulty following directions. For other students, their characteristics such as being able to speak very fluently, but really only on a topic that's of interest to them, might mean that making friendships are really hard, and that might be the implication or the impact of their communication difficulties. It might be that not being able at this point to communicate about a protest or a refusal or be able to say no in an appropriate way that's readily understood means that they're using behaviours that you don't want to see at school or that are really difficult to manage at home. And this might be starting to give you some ideas about the areas of communication that you know you need to tackle or that you might want to apply some strategies to and have a bit more of a think about. We're going to just spend the last part of the webinar having a look at some strategies for supporting understanding at first, and then having a look at some expressive language strategies as well as we go through. First of all, it is really useful to have a think about what you know already helps your child to understand at home, because it's the strategies that you've tried and tested that you might be able to communicate to the school. You might know, for example, that your child really will follow instructions really well as long as they're given one at a time, or that you're going to be able to get the best response out of your child if you call their name first, make sure you have their attention, and then give some information to them. You might also know that using pictures are really helpful, or writing information down, for example, for a child who reads or for an older child who might really benefit from concrete written information to help understand what's going on. It's also worth asking what the school's doing to help communication and to help the understanding at school. And they might find that they've got a whole lot of strategies as well that might be applicable to home that you might be able to use as well. What we're going to have a look at first are some visual supports and then some ways of looking at adapting our language. I think a lot of people are really familiar with visual supports these days, which is great. It's possible, though, that some of these ideas might be new for you, or you might get some inspiration for some of them. It's certainly also possible that your school might still be at a stage where visuals are a bit of an unknown, or that the way visuals can be used might not be very clear to them. There's certainly lots of different ways of using visuals. We use visuals because they tap into a real area of strength for many people on the spectrum. We know that children with autism tend to be better able to understand what they see compared with what they hear. And we know that visual supports can help students with a range of activities, including learning new tasks, understanding rules and social situations, transitioning from task to task, and that might be packing up the pencils and getting out the glue, or it might be going from the computer room to the science rooms and that kind of transition, or it might be those bigger transitions around moving classes, moving schools, moving homes, going from year to year with each teacher. And we also certainly use visual supports to help with behaviour. And on the screen you'll see some simple examples. Most of them are using pictures, And as it happens, most of those pictures are from a program called Boardmaker, but you certainly don't need to have a specialised program these days. There's so many images out there on the internet, and there's so many different symbol systems, and the ability to take photos and quickly print those is so easy these days that while these are using a particular software system, you certainly don't necessarily need that these days. The ones that you can see there are all about helping understanding of language. And for our younger students or our students who need more obvious and more concrete information, pictures and photographs are fantastic. For older students, just written words might be all they need, but those concrete reminders that they can that continue to be tangible and permanent might still be incredibly important to them. We know that visuals can be useful because they can help to reduce communication breakdowns. It's very clear, for example, what getting dressed means if you use a visual support, and you'll see that over on the left-hand side of your screen. There's a little visual about getting dressed with information about that. Getting dressed, for example, is a really complex task, and it involves a lot of steps, and a lot of the time for children with autism, they're not going to have the understanding of those individual explicit steps, but having a visual support means that they can start to develop some independence in that area, that the potential for communication breakdown is lessened, the potential for difficulties getting dressed in the morning and the stress that's involved in that might help to be alleviated a bit as well. So that's one there. Another one's a getting ready for school visual that the child can tick off. The one at the top of the screen in the centre is a work visual where you would encourage the teacher to, or you might do it for homework, but the teacher might just put 1, 2, 3 little items there or little visuals to show that this is how much work needs to be achieved and this is what's coming up. There's obviously a weekly timetable there that helps the child just understand that every Monday afternoon will be a science lesson and every Friday is Year 1 singing. There's reminders there about classroom rules, and these are the type of things that are really useful for all children in the class, not just the child with autism. But this is quite a nice tangible reminder. Then there's a really simple visual showing a first then chart where you simply put in what the child needs to do right now and what's coming next. For some people that might mean that we're going to do going to the park now and getting dinner after that. For other people it might be do your homework and then you'll get a Smartie, and that might be how you use those visuals. And then down the bottom right hand side you can see an I'm working towards visual. Again, just a really simple and tangible way of encouraging a child to continue to get through their work tasks with a concrete reward coming at the end of that. Other things we can use these type of receptive visual supports for is to really, as I said, increase independence, to decrease the dependency on constant verbal prompts, to hopefully reduce some behaviour and challenging situations when a child knows what they need to do and they know that there's a reward coming for that. Obviously, we want to increase understanding and really ideally our two big goals would be to develop success and independence and to promote that inclusion and participation wherever they go because they now understand what's expected or what's happening or what they need to do. The other really important feature of supporting receptive communication is adapting our language. And there are a few ways that we can really support children with autism by adapting our own language. The first one is to be very direct, to say what you mean and mean what you say. I think a lot of us who are teachers or who, and I think it's a big trap for speech pathologists, and it's always fun to see a beginning speech pathologist say to a child, do you think you'd like to do some work now? When actually what they need to say is, we're going to do this activity now. And we need to keep our language very direct and to really be very aware of how we're using our language and to say what we mean directly. We need to keep our language very simple. And this is often a huge factor in supporting children with autism's understanding of our communication. As I said before, we often overestimate, and there's a real risk in overestimating a child's language skills if they have got some good expressive skills, and that we actually need to bring our language right back to a level where we're very confident the child understands us and to use this level all the time. And again, in keeping our language simple and direct, we would also be really careful about using metaphors or too many idioms or too much metaphorical language that is confusing or is not direct enough for the child to understand easily. We need to give plenty of time to process our language. And Temple Grandin, who's an author and a professor who also has autism, talks about this very well. She has let people know that she needs plenty of time to actually understand and to think about what you've said and to process that. But she also says that if the speaker jumps in and clarifies or tries to help by rephrasing or by saying it again, that she actually goes back to the start of that processing period and tries to process again. So if possible, we need to give an instruction or give some information in a way that we're pretty confident the child has attended to us, so get their attention first, give the information, give the instruction, and then wait. And the average waiting time for a teacher in a classroom after they've given an instruction or a question before they say something else is about 1 second, which is no time at all for processing. But if you try this at home or in your classroom, you'll notice that 5 or 10 seconds of waiting time feels like an eternity. But it really is worth trying that and to see whether that makes a difference in how your child's communicating, how much they're understanding, and how well they're able to then follow your instructions or answer your questions. We know that showing and telling can be really helpful, and we've just had some ideas around visuals there, but it's also important to remember that visual supports might be simple as objects, such as, holding out the keys to show that you're going in the car, or a bag to show that it's time for school. We might do a bit of gesture or mime or demonstrating what we want the child to do as well, just to really help them use that visual skill and to tap into what's often an area of strength for many kids. We certainly want to avoid sarcasm. Children with autism have difficulties processing language in itself and understanding the meaning of words and the syntax and the way the sentences go together. But what's often a really huge problem, even for children who are going quite well with their language and their thinking skills otherwise, are things like sarcasm, where the intent of the communication doesn't match the words that are being said. So for those of us who are neurotypical, we can listen to the tone of voice, we can think about what the facial expression means, and we can think about the context of communication to decide whether that might be sarcastic or not. So if I was wearing, a lovely orange and brown striped mohair jumper and one of my friends raised an eyebrow and said, "Oh, nice jumper," I might actually need to interpret that as sarcasm, and I might need to act on that. For a child who's not going to necessarily read those facial expressions accurately or well, who might not understand that tone of voice, who might not necessarily pick up that the context doesn't match what they're saying, that's a really difficult thing, and they're not going to interpret that as sarcasm, and this will lead to other problems. And certainly we see lots of examples at schools and at home and in the community where a child might be confused or anxious or act inappropriately based on something that's been said in a sarcastic way or in a joking way or in a way where the meaning doesn't match the intent of the speaker. And it's something that as communication partners it's really worth being aware of. And I think we certainly want to try not to give questions as instructions. And I gave the example of the beginning speech pathologists that we see all the time, where they might very nicely ask the child, "Would you like to sit down and do some work now?" And they've got nowhere to go when the child says no. And similarly, we see in classrooms where lovely teachers try to be, use really polite language and might say something like, "Is everybody sitting up straight?" And the child with autism may interpret that question in a really literal way and answer the teacher that, "No, Johnny's not sitting up straight," or "No, I'm still lying on the floor." And this isn't helpful for them. We need to make sure that our intent matches what we're saying. And using questions as instructions isn't helpful for children with autism who are interpreting language in a literal way. Okay, we'll also have a quick look at some strategies for expressive communication, and as we did with receptive communication, it's worth thinking about what you know are your tried and true strategies that you know have helped, that you might be able to communicate with school, and it's worth asking school what they know might be helping as well at home, might be able to be interpreted and used at home. The first one is to encourage communication tense more generally, and to have a think about what your child is trying to communicate and how they're trying to communicate. I mean, to do that, we'd start by thinking about how the child is communicating and going back to those characteristics and recognising that some attempts to communicate might be actually very subtle and that they might be using apparently unrelated behaviours or actions that don't at first seem to be communicative, but in fact in a very subtle way trying to communicate something. And then once you've worked out what those behaviours are or what the child's trying to communicate either through their speech or through gesture or sign or other methods, you need to encourage them to continue to communicate at that level. And this might be achieved by following their lead and really showing an interest in what they're interested in or what they're trying to communicate about. Certainly providing a verbal or a visual model of what they want to say or what they can see. So, for example, if you've been led to something that your child wants you to show you or to request, but they don't have the words for it, you would say that as if they could say it. So if they've led you to the window and there's a bird there, you'd say, "That's a bird, a lovely bird." Or if they've led you to the cupboard or the fridge and you know what they'd like to eat, you give them that verbal or visual model. You certainly provide reinforcement for closer approximations of the level of communication you're trying to get to. So if they've tried to say a word or they've made a sound, you'd certainly get really excited about that and give that a lot of reinforcement, perhaps by giving them what they wanted or by giving them a lot of that social interaction or showing them how happy you are. We can encourage communication attempts by offering a choice, which can be very powerful, especially when we're not really sure of what the child's trying to communicate. That's a great way of encouraging communication. We can provide a verbal model or a visual model and give them some time to show what they want. And we can also expand on what the child said. So if they've used a couple of words in a sentence, we can model back a more complex or more grown-up sentence for them to say. We also want to create communication opportunities for the children to continue to use their communication. And there's lots of ideas about doing that, including lots of waiting time in your interaction so that there might be a space for the child to communicate with you. One idea is around adjusting the environment so that there's few distractions and that favourite things that you know the child is probably going to want, you might put out of sight, in sight, but out of reach, so that there is a need for the child to communicate something to you about getting those objects. You might be a bit forgetful on purpose. You might, for example, put the child into the bath with no water in it or give them a drink with no milk or water in it yet, just to try and prompt some either commenting or some requesting behaviours or even some very safe protesting behaviours where the child might be able to say no or give you some communication that you've done something silly or done something wrong. Using people toys for younger children is a great way to encourage communication, and that might be bubbles or balloons or wind-up toys that only you can operate that are a bit too hard for the child, or giving things one by one. And for older children, it's quite fun when the child's in the right frame of mind and you've got the time to do it, to be quite silly or to make some mistakes, just to prompt some communication and to show them how they might be able to continue that conversation or to clarify things with you and to work on some of those higher level language skills as well. The other thing that we do to support expressive communication is to use pictures and signs to support speech wherever that's needed. And for children who are developing their verbal skills quite well, this can still actually be a surprisingly helpful strategy. And one of the ideas is on the screen, and you can see 3 cards. There's the I need help card, I'm going okay, and I'm having a rest. And these are cards that are actually used by higher functioning children in the high school setting or in the upper primary setting, just to communicate subtly with the teacher, so that if it's very difficult for the child to put up their hand and ask for help because they're anxious or because they might not want to draw attention to themselves all the time, these are just little tiny communication cards that they can pop on their desk and that the teacher can read very easily just by having a look at what they're saying there. For those children who are having more difficulty developing their speech and language, verbally, we certainly do encourage the use of pictures and signs to support that speech as it's emerging. I think a lot of people are very worried about using augmentative or alternative forms of communication because they're worried the child won't then have a desire to speak or won't then have any need to talk. But we know that speaking is by far the easiest, quickest and most effective means of communication, and the child will know from the way you respond to their verbal communication that this is really, what you're aiming for, and that you'll encourage that all the way along. And we know from research that using pictures or using signs certainly doesn't delay or stop any child from speaking. And actually what we often see, particularly with the use of pictures, is that once a child has understood the purpose of communication, they've understood that they can communicate with somebody else, we do often see that verbal language, in my anecdotal experience, certainly does come on. And certainly in the research, there's no evidence to show that it stops anyone from speaking. And certainly I think it's also important to remember or to just know that if a speech pathologist is recommending some pictures or signs for a particular child, it doesn't mean that they've given up on speech by any means. It means that they've recognised that the child probably has a lot more to communicate than they currently are able to, and that we want to get them into that symbolic communication that's a little bit closer to words and to speaking as soon as possible, and that pictures and signs are one way to facilitate this. For those kids who are at a higher level of communication, we also need to remember that communication, even when you've got words and when you can talk in sentences, often isn't that easy. And for many kids at that higher level, they can speak well and they can certainly be very fluent on particular topics, but they might need more information and more support around conversation and around social skills and appropriate social communication. And so we know that some of these kids will often need further explanation or more explicit teaching about how to do that. There's certainly many kids will need explanation about details of really social nuances that they might have missed. They might not necessarily understand different people's body language, or to be able to read when someone's trying to take a turn in the conversation, for example, or when someone's really bored or wants to change the topic. Some kids will need some more explicit instruction about what's an appropriate topic for conversation with different people, and what's not appropriate. So they might need to know that, it's absolutely fine to joke about gross topics with your friends when you're in the playground, but you don't want to talk about those same funny topics with the principal or with the teacher or with Nana on a Sunday afternoon. That's some... And often really helping them understand that different topics might be appropriate for different places and with different people. A lot of higher functioning kids with strong language skills will still really need a lot of teaching around the meaning of abstract or figurative or colloquial language, so all that sarcasm or the idioms or metaphors that they might not understand, like a really obvious one is it's raining cats and dogs. But if you have a look at the language that's used around older children, there's a huge amount of metaphorical language or very complex and abstract language that's used all the time. This is also something to think about for older children when they're trying to understand novels, when they're participating in English classes and more high-level activities to do with language, that those higher level language skills might be a real area of difficulty that might need some more explicit teaching about that. A lot of kids need to learn the unspoken social rules of communication, like looking at somebody when they speak, or nodding or smiling when they're listening. And one area that a lot of people have found helpful, one way of thinking about this that many people find helpful, is to think about what's called the hidden curriculum, which has been written about a lot by an author called Brenda Smith-Miles. And she writes with other people as well about the hidden curriculum, which is all the things that you learn at school and in life that nobody actually teaches you. So at school you learn, no one actually teaches you that behind the toilets is where the naughty kids go, but everybody at school happens to know that anyway. And this is often something that our kids with ASD might miss out on because they're not picking up those social cues that are obvious, or they're not being told by other kids, and that they possibly miss these ideas because they're not reading social situations easily, and that's a real difficulty. Other things that might be useful to consider are things like social scripts or social stories that are developed by Carol Gray, and there's lots of information both on the Positive Partnerships website and on the internet more generally about social stories, as well as some of Carol Gray's other ideas around cartooning or strip conversations that involve the use of speech and thought bubbles to explain what someone's thinking and saying in a particular interaction. So this is where we'll leave the communication webinar for today. I hope that this has been useful for you. I hope that you've been able to apply some of the information that is very general in nature to your individual child or to your specific situation, and wish you all the best. Thanks for listening.